What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week, we're going to be making a BMX bike. So let's just dive into it. So the first thing on our list is to find some reference. So I quickly jumped on Google Images and found a bunch of random images of BMX bikes. Now, one of the most important references that we're going to use is this side profile from a BMX bike I found on Google. My plan was to use image planes in this video just to make the whole process a little bit quicker, and that way we didn't really have to guess all of the proportions from all of these components. So we're going to use this as our main reference, and I'm going to import this into my scene as an image plane. And I'm also going to use this one, which is a front profile. It's not perfectly orthographic or anything, but it's going to help me figure out the spacing between the handlebars and how those front forks so the tire can fit properly in between them. That way I don't have to guess the proportions of these tires or any of the other small parts of this bike. So now that we gathered all of our reference images, we are going to import those two image planes, one on the front camera view and one on the side camera view. Now, of course, you can find better orthographic images to be more accurate, but we're not going to worry or stress too much about getting everything perfect. We're just going to use this as a rough guide. And then once everything's set up, we can start blocking out all of our main shapes. Now, don't forget, this whole video will be available in real time, along with all the working files, so if you're interested in seeing any of that, it will all be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I am pretty familiar with bikes. I mean, I've ridden bikes in my life, but I've never really paid attention to all the components or really looked closely to how those little components fit together. So we're going to take our time and try not to rush anything. We're going to really focus on the blockout stage, make sure that all those main components are in the right place, and then we can start adding in a little bit more detail. Now, there are a few small things I wanted just to go over really quickly before we actually go into the 3D modeling, and then we can cover them more in detail later on when we go over the UVs. But two things in particular. Firstly, we can definitely reduce the polys on this bike if we really had to. I ended up just smoothing out a lot of these shapes. Now, you don't need to do that. And we'll go over this more in detail later on, but there's so many areas of this bike that we could cut back if we really had to. For example, there's two that jump out to me, one being the frame. I ended up just combining a lot of those cylinders together just to have a nice bevel so it looked like they were attached, and when we added the welding marks later on in Substance, it would just look a little bit better and more realistic. But that's just definitely one detail that you don't have to add, and you can get away with just saving a little bit of polys there so you don't have those bevels. Another really big one are the wheels. All those little cylinders for all those spokes in the wheel, that can just be a simple cylinder with an image of it. That way it looks like there's a bunch of little spokes and you can see through it and there's transparency, but in reality it's just one flat image. Oh, and one more really important thing to go over is the chain. So originally I was planning to create one small chain component, like a link of the chain, and then we can use mesh to basically duplicate them around a curve to create my whole chain piece. Now, sometimes, I'm not sure if this happens for others, and let me know actually, because I'm sure it does happen to other people out there, but for some reason, mesh doesn't work correctly. It's like it's not calculating it properly, or it's just acting super strange. And to fix it, I have to just restart my computer. It's a strange thing that's been happening for months or even years, and I've just become used to it. It's really annoying. It might be some sort of bug or something. But this actually happened in this video. Now, we've used mesh before, so if you're interested in seeing how it's done, I do it in a lot of other videos. But for some reason, it was doing its typical thing where it just required a restart. And to be honest with you, I had so many other applications open in the background, other work projects I was working on in the week, that I really didn't want to have to go through everything and save them to restart, to reopen everything just to make it work. And because my chain component was so small, I just decided to ditch the whole mesh idea and just duplicate them manually along that curve just to create my chain. So, like I said, it wasn't originally how I was planning to do it, and I will go over that really quickly when we go over the UVs, how I would do it with mesh. But in this video, I just decided I had zero patience. I didn't want to restart and close every application on my computer, so I decided to duplicate it a bunch of times. Now, luckily for me, the chain is pretty small, so it didn't really take much time. But if it was a much larger component and I really needed mesh to work, I would probably just close everything, restart it, and then it would hopefully be working properly. So I just really quickly wanted to make a note of that, because if you're watching and you get to that part in this video when I'm creating the chain, you'll see I start by trying to do the mesh workflow and it just doesn't want to work properly. So that's why I decided to ditch it and just start duplicating them manually. All right, so let's just take our time. Let's really try not to rush the blockout stage. It's going to be really important for this model. And once we're happy with how things are looking, we can start adding some more detail. So enough of me talking, let's just create a BMX bike. Alright, so here is the BMX bike in its finished form. Now, as you can see, I went ahead and duplicated my pedal over to the other side, along with the other small components, but everything else is basically the exact same. Now, what I decided to do is break this thing up into two different groups for the two different textures that I have applied. Now, why two, you may ask? There is no specific reason. You can go less if it's for a video game. You can go even more if it's just for a high poly, fun, cool render. So it's up to you. Just remember, video games want the least amount of textures possible. So I would probably combine these into one texture for a video game. You could even go away with two, to be honest with you. I thought two was fitting, so I just decided to go with that. Now, firstly, I just want to mention, I did go ahead and smooth a lot of things. So I added one subdivision to this tire, for example, but you really don't have to. I can unsmooth it once and go with something like this. You could even go less if you really wanted to. It's up to you, depending on your project needs and how many polys are required, but you can cut back on a lot of things like that. Same with this frame. I actually didn't smooth it, I'm surprised, but I would just add one smooth to it, which I was planning to, just to get a little bit extra curvature, and so it looks really nice. But I guess I didn't, so really not needed. Another thing, these poles, I decided to not merge these two poles, for example. I was almost just doing a test with myself to see if you could really notice a difference. This one, they're attached, so I have a nice little bevel, which looks really nice and realistic, but you don't really need to add that detail. You can just add a welding mark in Substance Painter and you can probably just get away with it. Or we'll see later if you notice a difference or not, but I just welded together these specific poles. But everything else is the same. I also added these last minute, these little pegs on the back. But everything is pretty straightforward. Let's reapply my smooth. So for the very first group is the frame, basically the main frame of the bike, including the seat and the handlebars. And once again, making sure that all of my shells are nice and straight. Not perfectly straight by actually using the Straighten UVs tool, but they're orientated nice and straight, either vertically or horizontally. And I say this in basically all my videos, but there's many reasons for this. One being the fact that when you're applying materials, if you're having any of these shells slanted diagonally or something like that, a lot of those, if you're doing wood, in this case we're not doing wood, but wood grains and markings and scratches, you don't want them. You want them to be similar on all these components, and if they're all orientated the same direction, in this case they're all vertical, I'll get nice detail in those textures. And sometimes you can see some weird stuff happening if your UV shells are slanted, because some of those markings are going to be slanted and they're just not going to look accurate to how you want them to. So I always find it's much easier to make sure that your shells are either vertical or horizontal. Another big reason for that is I wanted to add some text onto these and stickers, and it would just make applying the text harder because I would have to apply diagonally, whereas if it was just nice and vertical, nice and straight, I can just make my life easier when we go into Substance Painter and we're applying materials and details to it. And another big reason why it's important to keep your shells either vertical or straight is to save UV space. If I had to fit all of these shells and some of these were, were diagonally positioned, it would be hard to fit in all my other shells. So by making them nice and straight or fairly straight, you can have much more room to squeeze all your shells in to take advantage of all that real estate. So that's basically how I prepared this bike. As you see, it's pretty straightforward. These two forks on the front, these two pieces are sharing the same UV space. These handles are sharing the same UV space, and just trying to save as much space as we can to utilize our UV space, because as you may know, the larger your UV shells are in this 0 to 1 space, the more detail, the more pixels it has to work with, so the more detail you're going to see in your materials. So I like to just shrink down the less important stuff as I point to the screw, and it's very large, which is not really needed. I just had space, for example, that I just had to utilize rather than this being small. If you have unnecessary space, why not just enlarge the shell to get them more detail out of it if it's not being used? So I try to just keep that in mind when I'm spreading apart my UV shells. I know a lot of people use the automatic UV, which it's handy, but if I do that, for example, if I automatically lay it out, So if I lay out these UV shells, you'll see that they fit them all really nicely together, but it also unstacks a lot of my shells that I had originally stacked. And it also gives an equal texel density to all of my shapes and all of my UV shells, which is really a good thing in theory, but it's not always necessary. For example, if you look at this UV shell, this is the under part of the seat, and you're never gonna see this. So there's no point in this being so large because it's just, I don't need that extra detail in the under part of the seat. So I like to manually adjust my shells depending on how much detail I would like in any specific object. So if I Control Z this and I go back, you'll see that this under component here is just much smaller because I just don't need that detail. I can give that real estate to other components or other UV shells that are more important. For example, the top part of the seat. So I enlarged this one a little bit bigger and I shrunk down the bottom part. So I like to manually adjust my shells depending on how much detail or how important they are to the scene. Now this isn't always the best way to go if you're working in a video game environment and you're given directions to give it a specific texel density so the whole scene's accurate and you're not seeing certain UVs that are really high in detail and other ones that are very pixelated and low in detail. You can follow specific guidelines from your art director or your lead artist. In this case, it's just a fun object, and when I'm creating objects and I'm not under any specific guidelines, I like to manually adjust my shells to give more detail to the more important objects in my scene. Anyways, rambled on there a little bit longer than I wanted to, so let's move on to the second group, which is the tires and basically everything else in the scene. So I have the pegs, the chain, the pedals, and the brake. Once again, trying to take advantage of my real estate, really enlarging the more important components. So the tire is really important because I wanted to add a tread pattern, so I wanted the UV shell to be fairly large. And the less important ones are smaller. So all these little components here, they don't have to be too large since there's not going to be much detail on them. That's basically how I prepared my model for Substance Painter. Now I wanted to quickly go over a few things that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So one of them was talking about saving polys. Now, I know we quickly talked about that. You don't have to actually merge these poles together. You can leave them all separated like these ones, just to save on those beveled edges, to save on extra polys. But there's a lot of other details that you can save on polys. For example, these grips. I decided to just extrude them to add some sort of bump pattern. You could easily get that same effect in Substance Painter in the materials. So if I was trying to cut back on polys, I would make these handle or these grips just a solid cylinder, and we can add that specific bump material later on in the materials. Another big one is these chains. You really don't have to make these chains. I made them smooth so they look nice and high in detail, but you can really cut back on these chain components. These little cylinders that are in here are just ridiculously high for no real reason. It's just wasted polys. Obviously it looks cool, but that's not always the goal. Sometimes you want efficient models, and the chain is another big area that I would cut back on. And another one that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video were the spokes. Now, if this was for a video game, I would probably just use a simple cylinder, something like this, that I can position in the middle of my tire, and I can add a spoke detail, like a graphic to it. And using an alpha for the space in between the spokes, you can make those transparent so it looks like there's some spoke there, but in reality it's just a flat plane. And you see this all the time in video games to get away with things. Same with this chain. You can technically, if you really wanted to, we could do something like this. If you're really trying to cut back on a low poly bike, you could just have one face. Let's just extrude this. This is a quick example. This could be your chain, so you can have an image of a chain, for example. And in reality, it would just be an image of an actual chain link. It wouldn't be an actual detailed chain. So there's little things you can do to fake it, and especially if you're not looking at it up close, you really wouldn't be able to notice much of a difference. Those are just a few things that I would definitely cut back, especially these cylinders, for example. You could just reduce the amount of polys that these cylinders have just to cut back easily on polys, and you wouldn't be able to notice those differences as well. So there's lots of things that you can do. I also just noticed one little detail that's not in the video that I added last minute, which I should probably point out, were these little pieces here to air up the tire. These are just simple cylinders as well. Did not smooth them, probably should have, just for fun. And then this back one is the same. I just added a small cap onto it to make it just fun. Some little small detail. I'm not sure if many people will notice it, but adding those little details is always fun. It makes it just more custom, more unique. Adding those personal, not this is any personal thing to me, but adding one cap just makes it fun, like you're missing one. And I feel like all my bikes I've ever had in my life, I end up losing a cap on these. So anyways, that's how I decided to prepare this BMX bike for Substance. So all I have to do is just apply different material to each of these groups so we can see them in the texture set list in Substance Painter. Then we can export it and jump over to Substance. Oh, also, one other small detail you probably saw in the video, but I decided to also raise up my chair, my seat. It was originally a lot lower to follow this reference, but I thought it looked a little bit low. I don't know if it was just me. So I decided to raise that up a little bit. Not that that's an important detail, but you know, it is what it is. And I also obviously changed the position of these pedals. That way I could just position them in a different way I thought would be fitting for the video, for the final renders. All right, really quickly before we jump over to Substance Painter, I want to go over exactly how I would do the chain if my Maya software was working properly. So let's go ahead and let's quickly open another scene so we can go over that just very, very quickly. All right, so very first we need to create our curve. So what I'm going to do for this is create two cylinders. I can just basically bridge them together. I can select my outside edge and I can go to modify, convert, and then polygon edges to curve. Now usually this works a lot better. I'm not sure why it was acting weird in my software. I feel like my Maya's been acting strange lately. I'm not sure why. But we just have to manually adjust some of these little points just so it's nice and curved and it looks like an actual chain link. And then I can use that to actually position all my chains around using mesh. So once the chain is positioned and we have our curve in the form we want it to look like, we just need to create some small chain link that I can duplicate around this curve. So I'm just going to create a few small cylinders. I'm just going to create a very simplified chain link. Ours is a lot more detailed, but just for this example, I'm just going to use 3 cylinders and just combine them into one object. So once I have my little small chain link, all we need to do is basically turn this into a mesh network. So under the FX tab, I can go up to the mesh tab and choose Create Mesh Network. And now I'm just going to go to the Distribute tab in my attribute editor, just reduce those numbers or the distance down to 1 since we don't want them in a line yet. We just want to create one link. Then I can go to the mesh and create a curve node. Once I create a curve node, you can middle mouse click my curve I created earlier and drag that over into the input curves box here on the right. And as you can see, it automatically just positions my one chain link onto that curve. So all we're going to do now is just basically drag out the steps. That way we can increase the position of those chain links, and then all I have to do is just go to the Distribute tab to increase the number of points, so the number of chain links that I have. All right, so that's how I would have done my chain using mesh. Of course, we had to do it a little bit different and manually adjust those chain links, but it is what it is. So now we can export this BMX bike. We can jump over to Substance Painter and we can start our texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. Now, the very first thing I always like to do is just change the focal length. For some reason, Substance just starts it off really low at 17, and I like to just bump that up to 50, which is more accurate to how the eye views objects in real life. So we're just gonna bump that up to 50, and then I can go ahead and bake out my textures. So when it comes to the textures, everything is very straightforward. It's just like every other model we do on this channel. I'm just going to focus on filling in all of those empty meshes with some sort of material, and then I can build off of them and add more detail to them later on in the video. Now, I really didn't know what color I wanted to make my BMX bike, but I really liked my reference I was using, and it showed the BMX in some sort of blue color. So that's the color that I decided to go with, but I was really torn. I honestly wanted to make a white one for some reason, but I thought it was just kind of plain, and I thought adding some more color would just make it more fun. But let me know in the comments what color of BMX bike you would have chosen, because I was really struggling with this originally. I didn't know what color to choose, but blue I decided to go with. Now all the materials I use come with Substance Painter, so there's nothing unique that I downloaded off of their website or anything like that. The only unique thing I had to create for this was an alpha for my logo that I made on the very front, the PR for Polyrendr. And I just found a simple logo online, and I just basically removed all the text, converted it, just inverted the colors so I can make it black and white into an alpha, and I just changed the letters to P and R. That way I can just bring it into my Substance Painter project as an alpha, and I can just stamp that P and R right onto the front of my mesh. And another thing were just all those stickers. So this was very straightforward. I just jumped on Google Images and found random skateboard images or skateboard stickers, and I just saved those as PNGs, brought those in as textures, and I can just basically paste those again right onto my mesh. Other than that, all the materials I use come with Substance Painter, so it should be fairly easy to follow along. Actually, there is one more material, it's just the tire tread pattern. So I just jumped on Google Images and searched up bike tire tread, and once again, just inverted the image. It was black and white. I just wanted the background black so I can make it into an alpha, and then once again just drag it into my project as an alpha, and I can stamp that right onto my tire pattern. Now originally I was going with a thinner tire pattern. You'll see I basically had the tire tread as one specific texture throughout this whole video, but at the very end of the video I added an extra little slanted detail to widen the tire tread. I just thought it looked a little bit more realistic. I didn't spend too much time on the tire tread, and that's something, if I could go back, I would have spent a bit more time trying to find a tread pattern that fit the model a little bit better. But that being said, I'm still pretty happy with how this model turned out. Alright, so let's just slowly start building up our materials, and we can slowly texture our BMX bike. And don't forget, this whole video will be available in real time, so if you're interested in seeing all of this, you can find it all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. And I'm also going to upload all the working files, so if you're interested in opening up this Substance Painter file, you can actually go through all these layers and see how I prepared all of these materials. Alright, enough of me talking, let's start texturing our bike. Alright, and that is everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this BMX bike. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, please hit that like button, and also please consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, I want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreons. I really can't thank you all enough for your continuous support. It goes such a long way in supporting my page and supporting my art, so I just want to say thank you. And of course, don't forget all of my videos I make on YouTube. I upload a real-time version of it with the working files to my Patreon page, so if you're interested in getting access to any of that, you can find it all in the link in the description below. And I'm also going to continue uploading tips and tricks videos to my Patreon page, so if you're interested in seeing any of those videos, you can find them all on there. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and I will catch you in the next one.